Hey everyone, this is Music Tech Help Guy, and in this video, I'm going to give you an overview of using the mixer in Logic Pro, and I'll also break down each of the main channel strip components in the mixer. And I'll also touch on topics including channel strip settings and how to save and recall these, adding EQ with the EQ display, adding and using MIDI FX plugins, loading software instruments manually rather than using library presets, loading audio effects inserts and plugins, loading third-party plugins in the mixer. I'll give an explanation of how panning works for both stereo and mono channels, and I'll explain how digital audio signals are metered. So there's definitely a lot to unpack in this video, and this is going to be a long one, so buckle in. And as always, I've left timestamps and chapters below if you want to skip around. But before I get into the tutorial, I want to quickly tell you about the sponsor of this video, Boombox. Are you a music producer or mixing engineer looking for a better way to work with your clients? Look no further than Boombox.io. The Boombox platform allows you to upload your tracks and receive time-stamped feedback from your clients. This makes it easy to make changes and improvements based on their feedback. Plus, with their secure platform, you can be sure that your tracks are safe and only accessible to those you want to collaborate with. You can sign up for a free account right now and get 10 gigabytes of free storage. Or if you need more space than that, they have very affordable options for up to 2 terabytes of online storage. Okay, so first, let me just give you a quick recap of how to access the mixer in Logic Pro. There's a couple different ways. One way is just to click right here. This will open up the mixer. Click again to hide it. You can also press X on your keyboard to hide and show the mixer as an editor at the bottom of the window. You can click and drag to resize the mixer. And then just to make sure that you know that any key commands you're sending to the mixer are actually going to the mixer, you want to make sure that this blue box, this blue border, is around the mixer. That's showing that the mixer is in focus. So for example, if I'm working with both the mixer and the tracks area, if I click up here, now the tracks area is in focus. Any key commands are going to go to this area, whereas now when I click back down here, this brings the mixer back in focus. Another way to bring up the mixer is to press Command 2. This will bring the mixer up in a separate window. This is really helpful if you have a dual display setup and you want to have the tracks area on one display and the mixer on another display. And then to close this out, you can just click up here or press Command W to close the window. I also want to point out that there's a divider column here in my project. Just ignore this. This is here because I built this project using live loops. We'll come back to live loops way later in this series. So for now, just ignore this divider column if you don't see it in your project. Now, one thing you'll notice is when I open up the mixer, each track in the mixer has a color. And for the most part right now, the track color in the mixer is matching the region color out here in the tracks area. But I do want to show you that you can actually show your track colors in the tracks area and make them match up with your mixer track colors. If you right-click or control-click on any of your tracks in the tracks area, then go down to Track Header Components, you can select Track Color Bars, and this will show you the color of each track, and you'll see that these now match the mixer. And if you want to change the track color, you simply right-click and select Assign Track Color, and then choose a color. So if I choose this dark orange here, now when I go back into the mixer, you'll see that that track is shown in dark orange. So it's just a way to set your track colors and make them match the color of the tracks in the mixer. Additionally, if you want to get to those options without right-clicking or control-clicking, you can also just select a track and press Option T, and this will bring up the track options, and I can hide and show the color bars here, along with many other options. Okay, so let's go into the mixer here, and I want to point out which ones of these are software instruments or drummer tracks. I actually don't have any drummer tracks in this project, but software instruments and drummer tracks look pretty similar in the mixer. And which ones are audio tracks. The way you can tell which ones are audio and which ones are software instrument tracks is if you look at the input tab here, the ones that have software instruments for the input, like this one has Quick Sampler loaded on it. These are software instrument tracks. This one has DMD or Drum Machine Designer on it. So when the input is a software instrument, you're working with a MIDI-based track. So you're working with a software instrument track. When the input of a track is simply a microphone or line level input from your interface, then you're working with an audio track. So with this track, you can see here, there's no input. It's in stereo, and I can assign an input of input 1 and 2 up to input 9 and 10 on my audio interface. And if this were mono, I can only select one input at a time. So we've already talked about that a bit when we were talking about recording with a microphone. Another thing you can change in here are the icons that are used for each track. So you can see the icons for each track, but you can actually change this out here in the tracks area. So I have this track called Big Tom Loops. If I right click on this or control click, I can choose the icon that I want for this track. So if I go to drums, then I can select a tom icon. And then if I press X to open the mixer, you'll see that that icon is also shown in the mixer. Now on the far right, you'll see a stereo output track and a master VCA. The stereo output track is essentially like a master volume output on a mixing console. All of the other tracks in your project are going to be routed to the stereo output. They're all summed together on the stereo output, unless you change the routing of the output of the tracks, but we'll talk about that in the next video. So the stereo output will show you the signal level of your entire mix. It'll also show you if you're clipping or peaking. So for example, if I play maybe this section here, you can see that the peak signal level there is negative 2.4 dB. And if I maybe play this section, it's a little louder, but if I were to maybe pull up some of these a bit, you'll see that the stereo output actually clips and goes into the positive. Now, we'll talk about dBFS and how these values work toward the end of this video, but if your stereo output is clipping, it's generally a good idea to pull down the volume of all of your other tracks to compensate to make sure that your stereo output doesn't clip. Now, this is just best mixing practice. There are other ways to handle this equally as well. In fact, there are some easier ways of dealing with this that we'll talk about very soon. So now we're not clipping, but again, the stereo output is the sum of all of the channels, all of the tracks in your project. We'll talk more about how to work with the stereo output and master VCA in a future video, but for now, just keep them both at unity gain, which means you're not adding any volume or reducing any volume. So you just option click on both of these faders to set them to 0.0 dB. When it comes to selecting tracks in the mixer, there are a few different ways you can do this. If you want to select a whole range of tracks, you can select the first track, hold Shift, and then select the last track in that range. And then you can actually control all of the volume faders of the selection all at the same time. You can also control all of the panning of those channels at the same time. Likewise, if you want to move around, you can use the left and right arrow keys to select a track and move around. Or if you just want to select certain tracks, you can select a track and then hold Command and select just certain other tracks, and then you can have linked controls for just these selected tracks as well. Or you can skip all of that and just drag up here to select tracks with your mouse. At the top, there are three options here: single, tracks, and all. Most of the time, I just have this on the tracks option. All this does is it shows you all of the tracks in the tracks area, but down in the mixer. However, if I select single, this will just show you the selected track along with the stereo out and master VCA. So that's what I was saying before. Typically, I just keep this on tracks. However, the all option can be helpful in some situations. Essentially, what this does is it shows you all tracks in your project, regardless of whether they're inside of a track stack like the Drum Machine Designer kits are. So Drum Machine Designer, as we talked about before, is sort of enclosed in a folder called a track stack. And inside of that folder, there are multiple channels, one for each of the drum pads in Drum Machine Designer. So even if these are closed, if you're in all tracks mode, you'll see all of those drum tracks within the Drum Machine Designer kit here. You'll see things like the click track. You'll see an actual volume control for the click track here. But most of the time, I'm just working in tracks mode here, so I only see the tracks that are shown in the tracks area in the mixer. On the right here, you can also hide and show certain types of tracks. So if I want to hide my audio tracks, I can do that. If I want to hide my instrument tracks, I can do that. If you're using any auxiliary or other routing tracks, you can hide these as well. You can hide the stereo output, hide the master VCA. And on the far right here, you can switch between a narrow and wide channel strip view just by selecting between these two different options. One other thing I want to point out here is that your mute and solo shortcuts also work in the mixer. So if you select a track or multiple tracks, you can press M to mute those tracks or press S to solo those tracks. Next, I'll break down each of the channel strip components in the mixer. I'll just start at the top of the channel strips and work my way down. Now, if at any point you notice that some of the channel strip components are missing or not shown, you can go up to View, go down to Channel Strip Components, and you can hide and show each of the channel strip components here. You can also access this by right-clicking or control-clicking here, going to Channel Strip Components, and then you can hide and show the channel strip components from here. So at the very top, you have the channel strip settings. Channel strip settings are a way to save presets on a channel. So for example, this track is a Tom Fills track. It sounds like this right now. And it sounds that way because I have Quick Sampler loaded up with some samples loaded in. I'm using the channel EQ to boost the mid-range a little bit. I have a third-party plugin called Decapitator on here for some saturation and drive. And I also have the Vintage Verb from Valhalla, also a third-party plugin. If I wanted to save this as a channel strip setting for later, I can click on the Setting tab, and I could select Save Channel Strip Setting As. This will bring up a dialog where I can create a channel strip setting for this. So I'll call this like Big Toms or something like that. And even if I reset this entire channel strip, so if I click here and go to Reset Channel Strip, now it's just a blank software instrument. There's nothing on it. But if I click on the channel strip setting, my Big Tom's channel strip setting will show up here. And I can reload that. Not only does this reload all of the audio effects plugins on the channel, it also saves the software instrument that's on the channel. And now I have my sound back. So channel strip settings are particularly helpful for saving mixing presets on audio tracks and also for saving particular instrument settings, because the channel strip setting not only saves the instrument and plugins, it also saves all of the plugin settings as well as all of the software instrument settings. The next channel strip component is the gain reduction meter. This is only going to show up on tracks where you have a compatible compressor plugin like Logic's compressor loaded up. Now, I don't want to go into great detail about what compressors do. We'll talk about that later on. But as gain reduction is applied in the compressor, you will also see that gain reduction shown on the channel strip without even having to open up the compressor plugin. So I've got a bit of like a ducking effect on my bass there. And as you see the gain reduction being applied in the compressor, you also see it out here on the channel strip. Next up is the EQ display. The EQ display is a way to see a visual of what's going on in the channel EQ or linear phase EQ plugins, which are stock plugins in Logic. But you could also add the channel EQ with the EQ display. So for example, on my bass here, maybe I want a bit more of like a mid-range presence. I can double click on the EQ display, and what it does is adds the channel EQ plugin after my final plugin in my plugin chain. I can open this up and dial in a setting that I like. And once I create that setting, you can then see that in the EQ display. Next up are the MIDI effects. MIDI effects inserts are only going to be displayed for compatible software instrument tracks. So with drum kit designer tracks, these aren't going to work on the DMD channel itself, but they will work within the DMD track stack folder. And you can see I'm using a couple of MIDI effects here on these two synthesizers. In particular, I'm using the Arpeggiator MIDI effects plugin. Now, what MIDI effects plugins do is they affect and transform the MIDI signal before the MIDI signal hits the software instrument. So I've got these plucked chords. Right now, they just sound like this. And if I were to click here to bypass the arpeggiator on that channel, you can also do it right here within the arpeggiator plugin. You'll hear that the MIDI notes that are going to my software instrument are actually quite simple. But what I've done is I've loaded up the arpeggiator. I've selected a preset. This one's called Simple Chord Groove 1. And this is giving my chords a rhythmic chord motion. Now, there are many other different MIDI effects plugins. The ones I find myself using the most in particular are the arpeggiator, the chord trigger, the modulator, the transposer, and the velocity processor. Now, I will give an individual tutorial on each of these MIDI effects plugins at some point in the future, but for now, just play around with them, and each one of these has its own set of presets in them that you can load from the top. In fact, all of the audio effects plugins and instrument plugins in Logic have presets you can load from within the plugin window up here in the top left. Okay, so next up is the input section. And for audio tracks, as I said before, this is where you can select your microphone or line level inputs. And for software instruments, this is where you can select your software instrument plugin. So on this track here, you can see I have the Contact 7 instrument pulled up. This is a third-party sample-based instrument, and inside I've selected the Stray Light instrument. You're not going to have this instrument unless you've purchased it from Native Instruments. So let me try swapping this out for another instrument. So there's a couple little controls up here on the insert I want to show you, though. You can bypass the instrument here. You can click on the middle part of the plugin insert to open the instrument. And you can also click on the right side to change the instrument and also view your recent instruments, or you can select no plugin. So that's what I'm going to do. And you can see it's removed the instrument. And instead of using Contact, let's use something from Logic. I'll go ahead and use the Alchemy instrument. Click on it to open it up. And inside, I can search for a preset. I'll just search for pad. Let's try the 70s space pad. Yeah, I think I like this 70s synth strings better. Now, in some instruments, you can load the presets from up here, but in certain instruments like Alchemy, you can actually load the preset from within the plugin window. The plugin itself has its own preset browser. Next up, we have the audio effects inserts. This is where you can load up audio effects plugins. So for example, on my synth pad here, maybe I want to change the tone of the pad a bit. Maybe I want to give it some more mid-range, or maybe reduce the top end a bit. I can simply click on one of these available insert slots. You'll see your most recent plugins at the top, and then down here, you'll see all of Logic's stock plugins sorted into different categories. So for example, if I want some EQ, I could go to EQ, I could open up the channel EQ, click on the plugin to open up the plugin window, and I'll just press play and move around some of these controls and dial in a tone that I like. You can also resize most of these plugin windows by dragging on the lower left or right corner. You can bypass the effect within the plugin window by clicking here. And just like with the instrument plugins, you can also bypass the plugin by clicking on the left side of the insert. You can click in the middle of the plugin to hide and show the plugin window. And if you click on the right side, it brings up a similar menu where you can select no plugin to remove the plugin or select a new effect. Maybe I want to make this more of like a rhythmic sound. So after my EQ, I'm going to add another effect. This time I'll go down to modulation, and I'm going to load up the tremolo plugin, and I'll choose a preset from within the plugin window. So even your effects plugins will have presets you can choose up here in the upper left. I'm going to use this mono tremolo, and I'm going to sync this to an eighth note. Now, if I wanted to add some additional reverb after the tremolo plugin to give it a bit of ambience, I could do that as well. I can just add another effects insert here, go down to reverb, and I'll select the chromaverb reverb. Let's open that up. And once again, I'll just choose a preset from up here. There are different types of reverbs here. I'm just going to use the synth hall, and then I'll blend the dry and wet signal. Now, when it comes to using effects plugins, you can move these around, you can duplicate them. So for example, if I wanted this chromaverb effect on another channel, I could just click and drag it over to move it. I can click and drag to move it back. If I want to duplicate it, I can hold Option and drag it over, and I can just keep dragging as many times as I like, and I can duplicate that plugin as many times as I like. If I want to bypass all of the instances of a plugin on multiple channels, you can simply select those channels and then bypass one of the plugins, and it bypasses all of them. Likewise, if I wanted to remove these three chromaverbs, I could select all three of those channels, click here and select no plugin, and all three of them will disappear. You can also bypass these quickly by clicking and swiping up or down. So you can see I bypassed all three of them just by clicking and swiping down. Likewise, I can click and swipe down again, and it reactivates all three of those plugins. Now, if you have some third-party effects plugins or software instruments installed, you can also load these from the same menu. So for example, instead of using chromaverb, maybe I want to use a third-party reverb. So I'll just click here, and instead of choosing one of these pre-sorted ones that are all stock plugins, go down to audio units, and you'll see all of your third-party effects plugin manufacturers in this list. So for example, maybe I want to load up the shimmer reverb from Valhalla. I can open that up, and that's how you can open up third-party effects. It's very simple. Likewise, with third-party instruments, if I wanted to change this Alchemy instrument over to a third-party instrument, it works the same way. You just go down to AU instruments. So you're just going to skip all of these stock instruments in the list, go down to AU instruments, and you'll see all of your manufacturers here. So maybe I want to load up ANA2 from Sonic Academy. I can open up that plugin, and now I've loaded my third-party instrument, and I can tweak the settings in here. But one thing that's worth mentioning is not all third-party plugins will have presets up here in the upper left menu. So you may have to use the built-in menu within the instrument. So I'm going to go ahead and just choose a sort of ambient pad here. Next, I want to show you two important plugin settings. Go up to Logic Pro Settings, Display, and from here, you're going to go to Mixer. And here there are two really important plugin window settings. The first one is Open Plugin Window on Insertion. So if you're wondering why when I load up plugins, they're not automatically opening up, it's because I had that option turned off. If I turn it on, now if I load up a plugin, you'll see that it automatically opens up the plugin window for me. Personally, I like to turn this option off, but it's completely up to you. Most people actually prefer to keep this on. And second, you can show the recent plugin list in the plugin menu. So if you have this option turned off, you will no longer see your recent plugins in both the software instrument menu along with the audio effects inserts menu. So I like to keep this on because there are certain plugins that I use more than others, and I like to see them here in the recent plugin list for easy access. Okay, we're going to skip a few channel strip components here, including the sends, the outputs, the group assignments and settings, and the automation modes. Each one of these will have a dedicated video in the near future, and we'll be talking about sends and routing in the very next video. So let's move down to the pan knobs and the volume faders and meters. Now, pan might seem really simple. It just has to do with the position of an instrument or track in your mix. So you drag this over to the left, you hear it more on the left. You drag it over to the right, you hear it more in the right. And while that is true, it's actually a bit deeper topic than it seems. All of the tracks I'm working with here right now are all stereo tracks. So if I right click or control click on any of these pan knobs, you'll see that there's three options: stereo pan, balance, and binaural panner. The binaural panners we're going to skip for now because they're not really relevant to the conversation at this point. But by default, stereo panners are actually not stereo panners. They're stereo balancers. So what's the difference? Well, when you use a balancer, when you pull a stereo balancer over to the left, really what you're doing is you're reducing the volume of the right channel to make the instrument or track appear like it's more on the left side of the mix. Likewise, if I pull this over to the right, all it's really doing is just lowering the volume of the left channel to make it appear like it's more on the right side of the mix. And of course, I can option click on this to set it back to the center. So the problem with using stereo balancers is that if you hard pan anything, you're actually losing content from one of the channels. If I hard pan to the left, I'm actually losing content in the right channel. If I hard pan to the right, I'm losing content in the left channel. It doesn't compensate for the channel that's being reduced. So typically with stereo channels, I'll use the stereo pan option instead, because what this does is it actually independently pans each of the channels. So now if I pan this over to the left, what it's doing is it's keeping the left channel on the left, but it's actually moving the pan of the right channel over to the left channel, so we're not losing stereo information. Another added bonus of using the stereo pan is you can click on this green bar that surrounds the panner and drag up or down, and you can narrow or add width to the stereo image of the track. So if I narrow this, I can actually position this instrument and sort of localize it better in the stereo field in a more specific way, whereas you can't really do this with a stereo balancer. So if I want this track to seem like it's kind of in the center, kind of narrow, and off to the left side, I can be very specific with the location of that track in the stereo field. Now, a big synth pad like this, I'm probably just going to leave it on balance, and I'm just going to leave it center, so it's not really an issue. But maybe something like this bass line, where it's got this big wide stereo effect on it, but I want the bass to be more center focused, I can use that control to center the focus of the bass. One last cool feature of the stereo pan that I want to show you is if you hold Command and click on the stereo panner, this will turn it orange. And essentially what this is doing is it's just swapping the left and right channels. So this can be really helpful if you're working with stereo recordings that were made with two microphones, like drum overheads or acoustic guitar, and you need to swap the left and right channels for some reason. So this is just a really quick and easy way to do this. Now, when you're working with mono channels, there's only two options, pan or binaural panner, which, as I said before, we're skipping binaural panning for now. So you really just have a mono pan option here, which positions the single channel in the stereo field. So no need to deal with any of that balancer versus stereo pan stuff with mono channels. Last, I want to talk a bit about digital audio metering and metering digital audio signals in your DAW. This pretty much applies to all DAWs, not just Logic. Just about everyone knows that audio levels or sound levels are measured in decibels, or dB for short. Depending on what situation you're working with, you may see various different ways that decibels are represented. So, for example, sound pressure in the air is represented by dBSPL. SPL stands for sound pressure level. Metering sound in acoustical situations is often shown as dBA or dBC. These are different weightings of SPL. Or in audio electronics, you'll see things like dBV or dBU. So because the decibel is a relative unit, it requires a reference value. So the decibel is a meaningless unit unless you have a reference value to compare it to. And all of these options I've just mentioned all have different reference values. Now, in digital systems like DAWs, signal levels are measured in meters in dBFS, decibels relative to full scale. This means that the maximum volume of a digital audio signal starts at 0 and the signal level goes down from there. So let's check this out on the stereo output, since that's sort of the sum of all of my other instruments. I'm just going to press play and view the meter, and I'll talk about what's going on here with the volume fader and the meter as it's playing. Okay, so like I said, the volume starts at 0, that's the peak level, and then it goes down from there. The value you're seeing here on the right is the peak volume level that's being metered coming through the stereo output. So we're at -3 dBFS. Now, you don't have to say dBFS every single time. Most people just say -3 dB. If I were to pull up my instruments, you'll see that the signal level gets higher and higher, and eventually we get into the positive. Now, once we're in the positive, we're clipping or peaking. So it means that the signal level is higher than the maximum signal level can be. And if I were to go and export this track right now, parts of the audio are just going to be truncated or sort of cut off to only hit the 0.0 dB ceiling. So you can kind of think of 0.0 dB as like a ceiling where you can't go any higher. Now, the great thing about modern DAWs is that the resolution of the mixing engine of the DAW is actually much higher than the resolution of the audio file that you'll eventually export or bounce out of Logic. So this allows you to clip or peak, but you can easily recover these peaks in most situations as long as you haven't clipped a recorded signal, which is why it's possible to have positive peaking values like this without getting a bunch of nasty distortion on the stereo output. When you use your volume fader, you can get positive values because this is representing added gain or added volume. So if I option click on this, it's called unity gain because there's no added gain. It's just at 0.0. If I pull this down, I start to reduce the volume. So the peak volume was -2.2 before, but if I pull this down by, say, 5 dB, and I click on this to reset it, now you can see that my peak value is around -7. So we've reduced the volume by 5 dB. Or likewise, if I pull this up, you'll see this creeps closer and closer to peaking, and eventually it will clip or peak and go into the positive. And you can just click on these little clip lights to reset them. Now, when you're working in post-fader metering mode, when you pull a fader down on a channel or multiple channels, you'll see the signal level reflected in the meters. So if I pull this up, you can actually see the signal level goes up, pull it down, signal level goes down. And that's probably what makes the most sense. However, as I demonstrated in a previous video, if you switch over to pre-fader metering, the meter now comes before the volume fader. So if I pull the volume down on these channels, you're not going to hear them, but you're still going to see the signal level coming into the meter because the meter is before the fader at this point. So just be very aware of that. If you're working in pre-fader mode, you're not going to see any volume changes on the meter. And in some situations, that may be what you want. For me in particular, I always use pre-fader metering mode when I'm trying to set my signal levels for recording with a microphone. because it lets me see the signal level before any volume adjustments. Now, one last thing I want to mention here is that while the signal flow from the top of the channel to the bottom of the channel seems pretty self-explanatory, there's actually one thing here that I want to point out that is really important to remember, and it'll be even more important as we start working with sends. The pan knobs actually come after the volume fader. So even though it looks like the pan comes first, then volume second, it's actually volume first, then pan second. So this will come into play as we start talking about post-pan, post-fader, and pre-fader sends down the road when we get into mixing. Okay, so that's an overview of using the mixer and channel strip components in Logic Pro. In the next video, I'll move on to using sends and buses and explain how these are used for routing time-based effects like reverbs and delays. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to see more content like this. As always, thank you so much for the support, and thanks for watching.